I serve as one of the non-execs on the Natural Cambridgeshire Trustees Board, which is why I've landed in this particular role today with a couple of people away. I would ask you to please make sure that you are muted. If you want to ask questions after each session, we're going to have a small question and answer session after each speaker. And if I don't get to all of you, my apologies, but we are on quite a tight time schedule.
Oh, I've just started the Cambridgeshire partnership.
Then towards the end, hopefully, there will be a little bit of time for more questions if you didn't get a chance to start with. So without further ado, I think we're literally on the wrap of 10 o'clock. I'm going to start off with our first speaker. Dame Fiona Reynolds spent much of her early career with the Campaign for Rural England and what was previous to that Council for the National Parks, before becoming its chief executive for a lengthy period. After that, a small spell in the Cabinet Office in charge of the Women's Unit from 1998, before she then moved on to be the Director General of the National Trust for 12 years in 2001. Then being the Master of Emmanuel College came along, which she did for a further 9 years, before finally offering to take up her current role as Chairman of the National Audit Office. So quite a CV, to say the least, Fiona, and we're very much looking forward to hearing what you've got to say about the National Audit Office's incredibly important role when it comes to farming and the environment. And as a non-exec director of the RPA, I can assure you it's quite a challenge. So I think without any further ado, we will be recording this session if you hadn't heard that in the background. I will hand over to Dame Fiona.
Well, thank you, Tim. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And I know many people on the call. It's lovely to see you from both my National Trust days and, of course, my time at Emma. But yes, here I am wearing another hat. Not completely new, actually. I'm now in my second 3-year term just, and thoroughly enjoy and feel very privileged to chair this fantastic organisation. The rigour and the focus of our teams is absolutely important. And of course, we're central to holding the government to account for the way that it spends and manages money on our behalf as the public. So it couldn't be more important and more timely. The reason we're here is because we've just published a really important value for money study on the Farming and Countryside programme. And that's been thrown into sharp relief at the moment, as many of you will know, with speculation that the budget may be cut from DEFRA. And one of the issues is around take-up and actually farmer engagement with that programme. So I'm not going to say any more because I'm going to pass on to our team. And we've got here Rich Sullivan-Jones, Dan Very and Sarah Hipkiss, who have all done the work and are responsible for our work in this broad area. So without further ado, I'll hand over to them. They have a short presentation and then we've got time for questions. So thanks so much for inviting us.
Great, thanks, Fiona. Maybe if we introduce ourselves briefly first, and then I can put up the short slides as a guide to discussion. So my name's Rich Sullivan-Jones. I'm, as of last week, the director for our Value for Money work on DEFRA and the DEFRA group. So full disclosure, I was not directly involved in this particular piece of work. It was led by my predecessor, Keith Davis. But I've been brought very much up to speed. I've been at the NEO 15 years. I've kind of had a good awareness of what's going on in our DEFRA work, and I'm joined by Dan and Sarah, who did work on this particular report. Dan, Sarah, do you want to briefly introduce yourselves?
Yeah, hi, Dan Very. As Rich said, I worked on the report. I've worked at the NEO for about 15 years, and in the DEFRA team for the last 4 or 5. I also worked on the previous study looking at the environmental land management scheme.
And hi, I'm Sarah Hipkiss. I was one of the other analysts on the study with Dan. I didn't work on the previous farming study, but I have worked on DEFRA for half a dozen years, and I've been at the NEO for almost as long as Dan has.
Perfect, thanks both. So we're going to test the technology now.
Rick, just before you start, can I just say,
yes,
I think if we could do about 20-25 minutes and leave
absolutely fine, that's no problem.
A good 5 minutes for questions, that would be really great. Thank you.
Absolutely fine. So the presentation itself should be quite short, 5, maximum 10 minutes. So it should be mostly actually time for questions and answers, which we can ultimately cut as we need to. So please let me know if this is sharing correctly, if you can see the slides. Is that okay? Good. In that case, without further ado, I will go on. So just to start then, a brief recap. Many of you may be fully aware of this already, but just a quick recap in terms of what the Farming and Countryside programme is. So the government described it as the biggest change in agricultural policy in half a century. It's a byproduct partly of leaving the EU, where the schemes were based around payments to support farmers based on essentially the amount of land that was being used for farming purposes. The UK government saw an opportunity to phase this out and replace it with agri-environmental schemes, essentially grant-based payments that incentivise and support farmers to do things on their farms, conduct the business in a way that supports agricultural aims. Much of that was through environmental land management schemes, which, as Dan said, we've reported previously on. There are some other initiatives, such as productivity measures to support farms. And so the Farming and Countryside programme kind of wraps all this up really in a single programme that tries to reset and take a new approach really to the way that farm businesses are supported across England. So I won't say much more on that. That's just a kind of brief introduction to what the programme is. And so we'll just quickly talk through our main findings in three broad areas, which mirror the three parts of our report. So the first of which is sort of DEFRA's overall management of the programme and kind of coordination of it as a programme. The second is sort of progress in supporting the environmental objectives and how these are balanced with the sort of tensions and trade-offs with food supply production. And then the third section is around sort of the sustainability of the farming sector itself and the progress there. So first of all, DEFRA's management of the programme. So the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, given the scale of the programme, has had its usual processes for reviewing it as a programme, and in its recent assessments has highlighted some fairly positive features actually in the way that DEFRA manages this as a programme. So examples include things like programme leadership and management, risk management, stakeholder engagement, a number of the things that it looks for from good programme management that it sees. But it's also highlighted some particularly external factors beyond DEFRA's immediate control that create quite significant challenges that is not sort of wholly convinced that DEFRA is entirely on top of. And it's highlighted the need to really sort of sharpen its plans going forward and improve the longer term picture really. So within this, we also looked at several areas of DEFRA's approach. One of the things that we found quite interesting is the way that DEFRA's taken quite an iterative approach to this programme. So rather than designing the programme and designing all the schemes in a lot of detail right from the start, it's consciously taken an approach where not everything is defined in detail, and it can tailor things as it identifies, for example, take-up rates or the impact of different sorts of measures. So we've seen examples of how that's allowed it to improve some of the schemes, improve take-up, but it's also created quite widespread uncertainty across the sector, where farm businesses are finding it difficult to really plan ahead in terms of what the longer term picture looks like. DEFRA also lacks some key data that needs to make timely decisions. So, for example, some of that feedback loop in terms of what's working and what's not. And there's also quite a big IT problem that DEFRA has ended up in, where it initially was using, I mean, Dan and Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I believe it started off just using the same systems it was using to produce the direct payments through the EU schemes previously. But this has a shelf life that essentially expires in terms of the suppliers providing services for this contract. I see Tim nodding. So it's obviously known to you. And this comes to an end, and it's really not that far away, and there is not currently a plan to replace it. Now, that doesn't mean that payments stop, but it would mean that other things such as changing or introducing new schemes, new environmental schemes, wouldn't be possible and at some point the system would fall over entirely. So there's a fairly urgent issue there that definitely needs to resolve. I will pause there for Dan or Sarah to add in any other kind of points of detail that I've glossed over in my brief summary.
I just wanted to add one point on the third bullet point, Rich, about the lack of data. And I guess the main gap we found was environmental outcomes and how they're linking take up of schemes and you know, farmers taking up different grants. But what actually ultimately that produces in terms of environmental outcomes. And that's quite an important gap for them to fill, in a sense, as they move forward. And they recognise that, but I think that was the main gap that we felt there was.
Excellent.
And
Thanks, Dan.
can I add just
Sarah, yeah.
almost for fairness for the Farming and Countryside programme, the legacy systems issue isn't just the Farming Countryside programme, it's an issue across DEFRA. I worked on the study, the modernising aging digital services study a couple of years ago, and legacy systems is an issue right across DEFRA, which they're starting to get a handle on, but it's still fairly high risk for them.
Thanks, Sarah. That was a really excellent point. And indeed, it's not just DEFRA as well. And any avid readers of NEO reports will know that this is a not completely, you know, common across every single department to the same extent, but it's a common issue across government. So no, really important point. And thanks, Dan, also for that point around the data on environmental outcomes, which is a nice segue as well into the second area of our findings, which is around delivering these environmental outcomes, as well as food production and food supply. And really our overall kind of conclusion here was that DEFRA still has quite a lot more work to do on its environmental objectives for the programme. So as Dan pointed out, there's just a lack of data really on actually the outcomes from these initiatives. They're making quite good progress in increasing take-up of these agri-environment schemes. Partly that's through this iterative approach. So, you know, one of the things it did, it kind of recognised that the way it did initially, its initial design for these schemes and the way that farms could apply for grants wasn't prompting take-up, it wasn't instilling confidence. And they simplified things in some ways and saw quite a big increase in take-up, which is good, and that's a positive thing. And we, you know, we recognise that. But it does create challenges for targeting because it's not, you know, there's less clear evidence on the extent to which the things that are being taken up are the most impactful and helpful for environmental outcomes. There's also potential questions around the balance of, you know, the linkages between different types of schemes, different types of initiatives, where doing one thing may be very effective if other things are in place, but if other things are not in place, actually the impact of that may be much more limited. And that's currently lacking in the approach. The priority has been take up, and that's, you know, understandable. But I think we've really pushed for a more targeted approach going forward in terms of how can we actually get the environmental outcomes we're seeking. And there's also the challenge of balancing this with food production, because some of the sorts of environmental measures may use up or partially use up land that could otherwise be used for producing food. Therefore expects productivity gains to help with this, and some of the productivity measures as part of the programme are intended to help with that. There will also some of the agri-environment schemes are expected to help with things like crop yields. So things that improve the quality of the soil, for example, is good for the environment, but also can help with the productivity of the amount of food being produced on any given acre of land. But there's a challenge there, and DEFRA's not sort of really got a good grip on how to navigate through this. Again, Dan, Sarah, anything you want to add on this slide?
Again, just on the third bullet point about the targeted approach, and I think DEFRA's view on this is getting take-up, getting high take-up will hopefully enable farmers to then transition to more targeted schemes. So I think that's their sort of that's how they hope it's going to work. We were a little skeptical about whether there is that obvious follow through that as you sign up to basic schemes, you will then naturally progress to more complex schemes. But that's sort of DEFRA's view on it.
Great.
And the thing I was going to add was about the second bullet, how DEFRA's making rapid progress. Part of that is they've reduced the amount of time it takes them to process the applications. It was several months in 2021, but it's gone down to just over a week this year. something that I should add that DEFRA is very proud of.
Yeah, and rightly so. And that kind of efficiency is something that in other parts of government takes a lot longer to get on top of. So no, definitely some positives there.
Rich,
Excellent. Thanks,
there are
both.
a couple of questions in the chat. I don't know if you want to cover those
So
now
I
or
can't
at the
currently
end,
see
or-
the chat. So I did wonder if we've only got one more slide, whether
Yeah.
we just finish off the broad coverage of the report and then come to questions as a group at the end. I think that let's go with that. That's okay. So on to our final section, which is really around securing a thriving farming sector. So as well as meeting environmental aims and meeting kind of food supply needs, there's also the sustainability of the farming sector itself. There's a reason that the grants existed within the EU systems and still exist now. And as Fiona mentioned at the start, quite relevant to some of the questions at the moment in terms of government potential announcements around funding for this area. And I mean, yeah, so DEFRA ultimately its understanding and its approach currently is that many farm businesses will need to make productivity improvements. Some of that may be supported by some of these agri-environment schemes, but also other ways of improving productivity if they're going to remain viable. Many will be viable anyway, but many would not without making productivity improvements. And at the current point in time, there's quite a high level of uncertainty of whether all farms will be able to do that. Many will, some may not, and there's a high level of uncertainty there. And we found some limitations in the quality of advice and support that's available to farmers. And again, Dan, Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think my understanding here is that quite a lot of the emphasis has been on sort of the business management side of things typically, but less in the space of actually productivity enhancements and things like that. But you may want to see more about that particular point.
I'm sorry.
You go, Dan.
Yeah, sorry. I just on the advice and support point, I think what we heard was as Rich said, most of the sort of advice and support that's been in place at the moment has been focused on sort of managing the transition away from direct payments to and how you manage your business. What we heard from a lot of farmers and other stakeholders is that advice and support now needs to go wider than that and help farmers to understand, in a sense, the whole farm view of how they can run their business whilst becoming more environmentally friendly, whilst maintaining food production. And it was felt that was a pretty big gap in advice and guidance, which we heard continually across our sort of engagement with stakeholders and farmers.
Excellent. Thanks, Dan. Sarah, anything else you wanted to add, or was it the same point as
it was
Dan?
exactly the same point.
Joined up thinking, perfect. Excellent. So that's it from us. But very happy to take questions, and I understand there are some in the chat. So what I may do is stop sharing so that I can see them.
If I can start off by just picking up on two of the questions from Owen Mountford was asking about the work done at Exeter, and has that been used to a certain extent to help inform the outcomes, or rather better environmental outcomes. I don't know whether you have got a comment about that.
Not specifically about that study. What we found was DEFRA had done a lot of work and had done a lot of research on what works, what doesn't work, through tests and trials, through studies, through surveys. So I mean, I'm sure they would have taken that study into account. I mean, I think, as Rich said, what the big challenge for the program now is they've got high take up. What they need to understand is what the mix of all these schemes is to get them optimal environmental outcomes from the budget that they've got, in a sense. And I think that they are. I mean, our impression was that they were really thinking about that and trying to understand that and understand the trade-offs. So I think, but a lot of research going into it, I think. But I can't specifically say what impact that specific Exeter study had on their thinking.
Okay, thank you. I'll move on. I was going to answer Sue's question myself, which the answer is quite definitely no, not sufficient advice at the moment. And we have been pushing really hard through the RPA to try and make sure that better advice is meted out to the farmers. Interestingly, the RPA inspector's role, I think, is changing quite significantly to become an advisor and a facilitator, which has gone down very well and is needed to try and get the engagement of the farming sector as well. Red Tractor, it's under pressure at the moment. I don't know whether the NEO would have any views on the question about is there a way of bringing sustainable farming practices more to the fore other than just through Red Tractor.
Sorry, Fiona, did you want to say something?
I was just going to say, I mean, I think DEFRA has for a long time, and particularly in the old scheme, had a sort of flaw in terms of, you know, basic soil health, basic standards which were required. And the Red Tractor is, you know, is a slightly different thing. It's a marketing tool. So I think it's down to DEFRA actually to re-establish, and as Rich and others have said, you know, soil health is the key, and finding ways of measuring soil health and sustaining that commitment to soil health, I suspect is. So I think Red Tractor is a slight distraction because it's basically a marketing brand rather than a sort of standard setter across the piece.
Just wanted to add a bit, and we did speak to the British Retail Consortium about in a sense how their supply chains are now demanding, you know, better environmental reporting and better environmental standards. And so I think we didn't cover it in huge depth. We have to scope the study to make it manageable, but certainly there is a pressure now coming, I think, from the supply chains and the supermarkets that again will bring a certain pressure, but I think that does need to be joined up a bit more with schemes and what DEFRA are doing to get that coordination of all of that pressure together. But we certainly did hear that quite a lot. The farmers are now feeling the pressure from not only DEFRA to make environmental gains, but suppliers too.
I would only back that up. I have protocols to abide by for Weetabix, for Warburtons, and that's the way that you're going to see change. The Red Tractor, if I'm being really honest, is there are many people who think it's possibly had its day, but because we're getting so many specific schemes from suppliers asking us to produce anything from carbon data through to environmental outcomes, etc. I'm going to move on because there's a hand there for Peter. Peter.
Yeah.
Does the NAO have a view on using agricultural land for other purposes like biofuels and solar panels?
I mean, that's quite a big question, and not something we would typically form a direct view on. So as people may be aware, so our remit, the NAO's remit, does not get into the question of policy objectives. And, you know, specific prioritization decisions is not something that we'd necessarily get into directly. And so bigger questions like that are not necessarily for us to be commenting on. We're more looking at the efficiency and effectiveness with which government bodies and other public bodies are implementing the you know, sort of ministerial aims. Fiona, you may want to add to that as well.
I was going to say exactly the same. You know, policy is set by the government. Our view is to analyse the effectiveness of implementation and delivery of the government's intentions. And, you know, with my other hats on, as you all know, I've been pushing for a land use framework for a long time in order to make better decisions. But it wouldn't be for the NAO to be part of that process. It's we audit and analyse what is in place. But I think it's clear already from today that process of auditing and analysing does bring out some really helpful insights, and that's really what we try to do, to use those insights to help government do a better job. And DEFRA is listening. DEFRA is definitely listening to the findings of our study.
Absolutely.
I'm going to pick up a question from Rowan, if I may, about the interaction of the various schemes. And I don't know whether the NAO have got a comment on this, but certainly from a farmer's point of view, one of the increasing difficulties going forward is the plethora of schemes that are out there, and we're all getting very confused.
So yes, I mean, I just want to yeah, Dan, you can probably give more detailed insight on this, but just, as I said at the start, I didn't work on this particular study directly. And picking it up, I mean, I found it an excellent report and a really fascinating read, and I'm grateful to people like Dan and Sarah for getting me up to speed on it. But the first time I read the report, I was similarly trying to get my head around the different schemes, and this was, the simplified NAO version of things, and it is confusing. And the way the different sort of initiatives and schemes interact with each other, I think is certainly a question that we're interested in, and we've kind of questioned DEFRA a little bit as well. But Dan, please do.
I was just going to say the same. I mean, our observation was, I mean, what one example was when we started the study, we signed up to the DEFRA blog, and very quickly you get swamped by a blog a day on different schemes, what's happening in different areas, and it is really, really difficult to keep on top of what's happening, what's changing, how they interact, what you can apply for, what you can't apply for, and so I think you're absolutely right. I think that does need to be simplified, and I think that's part of the package of advice and guidance that DEFRA need to develop to make that much clearer to farmers, and again to give them that whole farm view of what they can do, what they can't do, what's best for them. I think it all wraps up into that, really.
To perhaps to bring it to light, as a farmer, I now have a higher tier stewardship scheme. I have what's called an SFI 23 scheme. I'm about to enter an SFI 24 scheme. And most of them overlap each other massively. And what I crave for is them rolling the whole lot together into one scheme, so I can have one scheme with differing elements of ambition within them, but at least I then have the one scheme on my farm. And so that's from a personal and practical point of view. Roger.
Thanks, Tim. I was concerned at the beginning of the talk about saying that one of the big gaps is we don't know what the impacts are really are, and the other gap, of course, is how are any impacts, outcomes going to be sustained? I don't know whether previous schemes have been looked at. Owen mentioned a previous scheme. I worked with Sainsbury in about 25 years ago, in the good old days of the UK Biodiversity Action Programme, when they required all their suppliers to have one or more BAPs on their farms to be suppliers. And I'm not working for English Nature anymore, which I was then, but I've got no idea whether these were sustained. Is any of this being looked at? I think this is what it's all about, really. We want sustained impacts to give us more biodiversity. So what is actually being done about this?
That's, I mean, an excellent question. I don't know that we're able to answer it from this particular study, and that's the gap that we found as well.
No, but it's also a really good point about public money. If you pay public money to deliver benefits that are then destroyed, either because the farmer doesn't renew or because the scheme has moved on and wants something else, then there are real questions both about long-term environmental goals and commitments, but also, frankly, value for money. So there's a very good question.
So just to add to that, Roger, I mean, I think part of what DEFRA is hoping will happen is that as farmers take up some of these schemes, some of them and it's a long-term thing, but some of them will actually make their businesses more profitable if soil improves. So for lots of these environmental schemes, it goes hand in hand with productivity gains. So you would hope that they would continue those as they see that their soil improves or crop yields improve simply because they're doing environmental things. So I think there's an element that they might become self-sustaining as farmers understand the benefits of some of these things, at least.
Okay, I've got two more questions, Andrew and then John Shropshire. And then sadly, I think for the moment, we're going to have to draw this part of the day to a close. But Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. Andrew Marriott from the CLA. It's just really touching on the advice or the lack of advice, the incorrect advice that's coming through to the sector at the moment. I know the focus of our work has been to try and distill all of the, as you said, the plethora of different schemes and try and make it as straightforward as possible so that members can understand what they can apply for and when. But we know that's difficult because it is a bit of a changing picture. But I just wondered if in the study, if the Future Farm Resilience Fund, so the free advice provision, if that came into play at all, and if there's a feeling that it's at the point that it now needs to go beyond that. So yeah, I just wondered if that scheme in particular had any impact on this.
Shall I answer that, Rich?
Go on, Dan, yeah.
I mean, we heard a lot about that scheme. It's the big advice scheme, isn't it? 30 odd million going into it over the period of the programme, and very mixed reviews on it, to be honest. Some found it helpful, others found it a sort of bit of a tick box. 1 hour consultant coming out to their farm, knew nothing about the farm, got £500 for doing it and walked away. And so I think that there is clearly a need for something more than that. And we heard a lot about the importance of long-term relationships with advisors, and actually lots of people talking about historically the relationship they had with Natural England advisors on environmental issues and how important that had been for them making progress, and so that there's a model there which maybe, I don't know, going forward. But certainly
I would only add to that what farmers really need is actually environmentalists who can advise them, so they put together a scheme that really works for that particular bit of land. And if I think the money should be spent anywhere, it's trying to somehow find enough environmentalists to give paid advice as people start to enter these schemes. John, you had a question.
There was a point really to lead on from what Roger was saying about the Sainsbury scheme. I think it's 30 years ago, maybe more actually. I was quite heavily involved with a Sainsbury scheme and a Tesco scheme. And Roger wondered whether any of that progress had stuck. And I actually think that it did. I think a lot of farmers who were involved then, it sort of kick-started their involvement in the whole subject. And I think they were very, very good schemes. And I think quite a bit of progress stuck actually with farmers that supplied those supermarkets. Whether they're still supplying those supermarkets, I don't know, because there's always so much change in the industry. But I think quite a bit of it did stick. Certainly did with us. It kick-started, it was a catalyst for us in our business, for sure.
Thanks, John. As always, your knowledge of those relationships is you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I'm conscious we must finish, Tim, but I hope people have found that useful. Our teams just draw in so much knowledge and insight, and it's great to have the chance to share it with people, and I think this is a moment really for DEFRA leadership now, and we're really hoping that they were quite tentative early on, and that's why the iterative approach and the multiple schemes I think came partly because just of a lack of confidence that farmers would engage, but it also had the effect of creating uncertainty and lack of kind of confidence among the farming community. So with a new government, no political points, of course, time for a bit more leadership and a bit more, much better advice and engagement, I think will reap dividends. And I really hope our report helps that to happen.
I think I would add to that the fact that what we have to also understand is the fact probably for 50 to 60% of the farming community, livestock farming, this is a completely new game. We're quite experienced in East Anglia with all of this, but this is totally new to the livestock industry. And the more help we can get from the environmentalist community to try and educate people as to how to use their land effectively, both for the environment and productive agriculture, then I think we will make some progress. Dame Fiona and the rest of the team, I can't thank you enough. You've got a big challenge trying to almost play umpire with this one. But DEFRA have made a good start, but there is a significant degree of confusion and uncertainty right at the moment, which somehow we've got to break through. So thank you very much for your team, and I wish you well for the rest of your NAO day.
Thank you so much. Really nice to see you all, and thank you very, very much for inviting us. Yeah, thanks. We'll be in touch.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
All the best. Take care.
Thank you. Okay, right. We're going to move on to our second speaker now, and hopefully Brian, have you now joined us?
I have indeed, and apologies for missing the first 15 minutes.
That's super. Brian is going to talk to us about the beloved elm tree in a moment. But just to introduce Brian, from Durham University, where he studied zoology, he went to the Biological Records Centre for a number of years, and then on to be the conservation director of the Wildlife Trust in this part of the world, Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, and Northamptonshire. And that in that role was really leading all the teams that manage the nature reserves and giving advice to landowners, as I was explaining just now, so important going forward. And that moved him on to being the chief executive, as he is today, of Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire. He's also actually now a visiting professor at the School of Water, Energy, Environment, and I know Stephen Tompkins is on the session here today, and a subject also very close to my heart is chalk streams, and he may have a small view about that, but it's a topic we're going to take forward as an item, hopefully, to the next forum. So, without further ado, Brian, Elm Trees.
Thank you very much.
The boundary of my farm has 3 totally resistant elm trees on it. You'll be delighted to hear.
Excellent. That's very good to hear. And I'm hoping this will flush out rather more elm trees than people perhaps realise that they've got. So
Okay,
I'll try sharing my screen, and fingers crossed this will work. Are people now seeing the opening slide? Thank you for that.
Yes.
So in the next 15 minutes, you will get a very brief overview of work I've been doing on elm trees for the last 6 years or so, in a broader context as well, looking at the ecology and diversity of elm trees, and in particular, why I think they're vitally important in Cambridgeshire, perhaps more important in Cambridgeshire than anywhere else. So the starting point is to ask the question, do people care about elm trees and why? Tim's introduction suggests people very much do, and those who know that they've got elms are proud of it. I think the history of this goes back a few centuries. Elms were the largest trees growing in the English countryside. They figured in English art for centuries. Constable without elms would be a very much weaker painter, though I think actually in some ways Stubbs captured the English elm with its rather figure of 8 shape, the broad canopy, the narrow waist, and then some sort of skirt at the base, rather better than Constable himself had done. If you talk to most people about elm trees, what they know is Dutch elm disease, all the big trees have gone, and the common perception is there are no elms left. They've been all killed by Dutch elm disease. It's a lost cause. For a variety of reasons, I've looked very closely at elms for a while now, and this is absolutely not true. And my favourite modern quotation is from the leading elm pathologist. And Joan Webber is recorded as saying there are probably more elm trees in Britain now than before the disease struck, which is very heartening. This photo, by the way, from Huntingdon, shows a fairly large botanist with a 4-metre set of loppers standing next to a brilliant mature elm at Shepherd's Close, a wood which is dominated by elm trees. Our greatest woodland historian and ecologist and Cambridge academic, Oliver Rackham, came out with this wonderful quote that there's a greater diversity of elms than all of the trees put together. And I think he was right. And we're now getting the evidence to prove that the great man was correct. The other reason why conservationists care about elms is that they're a very important tree ecologically. Their flagship insect is probably white-legged hair streak. People like butterflies. This butterfly feeds solely on the foliage of elm trees. You can't have one without the other. But I'd broaden the discussion to say that there are other species, and the white-spotted pinion moth, this map's a little misleading. The yellow and blue dots are historical records, and what you need to look at is actually that cluster of modern post-2000 records, which were almost exclusively Cambridgeshire and Huntingdonshire and just spilling over into Peterborough and skimming Northants. This is a nationally scarce species for which our patch is the centre of the British range. If we don't save the white-spotted pinion, no one else can do. And there's a huge diversity of insects associated with elms, at least 240 species, and a high abundance as well. So elms are very good trees for feeding breeding birds. Most of our songbirds feeding on insects need trees like elms to do their stuff. They've also got a high diversity of other plants growing on them. This one of my favourites, and again, a bit of a Cambridge specialist, with the delightful and quite evocative title of the wrinkled peach fungus. So in future, if anyone talks to you about wrinkled peaches, this is what we have in mind, specific to elm and only on elm. And I'll come back to this right at the end of my talk, because this is one of the more interesting aspects of elm diversity. There are insects like these mites and aphids, which live within elm foliage and transform it through their biochemistry into these peculiar outgrowths, everything from the mite that forms the little pimples in English elm to the woolly aphid that produces a pouch the size of your hand on elm trees. And that's been recorded in Cambridgeshire in the last year. And again, something of particular interest to me, and for a study I'll touch on right at the end, leaf miners are insects which live within the leaf. The little white squiggles or the brown blotches are where a caterpillar or beetle larva are living between the upper and lower surface of the leaf, eating the soft tissue in the middle without breaking cover so they don't attract predators. Now, for those who've not been deeply involved, you may have missed the immense and vitriolic controversy about elms over the last century. We had in Britain two leading elm taxonomists, Ronald Melville, who came to fame during the Second World War as the man who discovered the vitamin C content of rose hips and the idea of rose hip syrup being the answer to a country cut off from its supply of oranges. Richard Richens, head of the Bureau of Plant Breeding, and also an absolute pioneer in computer technology for language translation. Two highly intelligent men who took totally opposite views of the nature of elms in Britain. And then the one that made the difference for me, Peter Sell and Gina Murrell published a 5-volume flora over the last 20 years. Bizarrely, volume 1 came out last in 2018, and the arrival of that book has dominated my spare time since 2018. Peter Sell was probably our best taxonomic botanist of the last 50 years. He worked in Cambridge since before the Second World War, right through until his death in 2010 or thereabouts. And Peter transformed perceptions of elms. Not everyone agreed with him. These are the standard floras that botanists have been using to identify their elms. Melville was responsible for the original account in the 1952 British flora. He identified 7 species, 2 subspecies, 3 varieties, 3 hybrids, 15 different elms that botanists could record and identify. Richard Richens influenced the 3rd edition of the same flora and boiled all that down to wych elm and what he called field elm, which was everything else. Clive Stace's flora has gone through 4 editions. It's the standard one that most people would use these days. And Stace recognises 7 species, 5 subspecies, and 7 hybrids. And then Peter Sell's work came into print. And Sell introduced the concept of 62 species or microspecies of elm. As I say, hugely controversial. Most people think that he was probably wrong. My own view 6 years in is that his 62 elms are recognisable and distinctive and different. Many of them are good species, many of them are hybrids, and some, frankly, I don't yet know what they are. This is how I've been spending my weekends for the last 6 years. Summers are out gathering live bits of elm. Winters are looking at pressed elms indoors. I've now got a collection of about 5,000 specimens. I visited half the trees that were surveyed by Peter Sell's PhD student back in the 1980s. Out of those revisits, I can say with confidence, 95% of elms were not killed by Dutch elm disease. The top of the tree was, and it was cut down to ground level, but 95% of elms have regrown since the disease hit them in the 60s, 70s, 80s. So a quick précis of the diversity of elms in Britain and in Cambridgeshire. Most botanists would acknowledge there's a large-leaved, rough-leaved elm, which in English we called wych elm, which has now 6 microspecies names attaching to it, if we believed in the microspecies. So wych elm, a big non-suckering tree with large leaves and very rough-surfaced, almost sandpapery leaves. English elm was the classic figure-of-8 tree that the artist painted. Very distinctive. It's got small, very round, extremely rough leaves, and that's been subdivided into 2 or 3 microspecies. And then the rest. Smooth-leaved elms, often with long, serrated leaves, but quite variable in shape, divided into at least 34 microspecies. And the final bucket, which previous authors have called hybrid elms, are now around 15 microspecies. You'll be pleased to know I'm not going to run through all 62 species in the next 10 minutes. But what I will do is say a bit about a few very distinctive ones to give you the flavour that elms are very remarkable and recognisable trees. So in North Northants, not far from the Cambridgeshire border, and I'm hoping this will turn up somewhere in Cambridgeshire, Laxton elm, only 6 trees known. They are massive mature trees. That's a normal garden fence at the bottom. And so we're looking at a tree with an enormous breadth and a very broad round crown and medium-sized rough leaves. Plot's elm is a fairly well-known tree, tall, narrow, floppy-topped. This used to grow near the bus station in Cambridge City. Alas, those trees disappeared about 10 years ago. And one of my absolute favourites, a species currently known only from a couple of ancient woods in Cambridgeshire, some fen droves in the north of the county, and a single tree on a roadside in Bedfordshire. The Hatley elm, to me, from a distance, looks more like a willow tree. It tends to fall down and droop. It's got long, narrow, pointed leaves with very fine teeth and looks unlike any other elm that I've seen. And a final one to just give you a flavour of how far they go. The pale-leaved elm is definitely a fenland elm, grows around the edges of the fens here and in East Anglia. It's got large, pale, floppy leaves on long stalks and tends to look from the distance rather like a birch tree rather than an elm. So elm can masquerade, it can be ignored. Many of us were trained to be elm blind because we believed the trees had gone. To my horror, I discovered that as soon as I got into elms that Oaks Wood, next to my office here in Camborne, has 12 different sorts of elm in it. And I'd been ignoring them for the previous 15 years. Oh, and I forgot to mention, there's some elms you can recognise from a distance even in winter. Bird elm with the knobbly bits down the side of the trunk. This is the dominant suckering elm in a site like Overhaul Grove. Does extremely well in this part of the world, not known outside of this small cluster. And large tooth elm, just one that seems to be overlooked, and we may find a few more sites for it. So why should we care about elms here in Cambridgeshire as opposed to elsewhere in the world? The simple answer is we have greater recorded diversity here than anywhere else on the planet. The French figures are not based on applying the Peter Cell taxonomy, but the Cornwall, Scotland and Yorkshire figures are real. I've spent a fair bit of time searching for elms there. You cannot find the diversity. And I love the idea that a single wood, Buffwood in Cambridgeshire, has 29 different elms, which genuinely may be more than the diversity in the whole of France. We also have more veteran elms surviving. There are some maiden trees, large, broad-crowned, healthy trees. But in the last year or two, a couple of people have been looking at pollarded elms in Parkland. And some of these trees are probably 500 or 600 years old. They've survived Dutch elm disease. They've survived the agricultural revolution. They're magnificent pieces of history, as well as pieces of local ecology. You might wonder why Cambridgeshire would have such a diversity of elms. My own guess, and at the moment it's little more than a guess because we need more genetic work from across Europe. If you look at Britain at the end of the Ice Age, until 7,000 years ago, we were not an island. The Channel and Doggerland provided direct connection with Europe. Elms had spent the long Ice Age winter of 100,000 years in southern and southeastern Europe. All the colonization routes, which we know that other plant and animal species took, bring them back to Britain, up the west coast of Britain, into of Europe into Cornwall, straight from the Mediterranean through France and the Low Countries, across the Channel into southern England. Very interesting colonization route along the River Thames, when the Thames was a tributary of the Rhine. So Rhine Valley elms colonizing along the Rhine and then going up the River Thames into Essex and into North Kent, and then species coming perhaps from a little further east across Doggerland into eastern England. Those arrows converge on Cambridgeshire. And my guess, as I say, is that at the end of the Ice Age, many elm species recolonised Britain, met up in Cambridgeshire for the first time in 100,000 years, and hybridised like Billio for the first 2,000 or 3,000 years, then stabilised when at the end of the Bronze Age, the temperature dropped. Evidence for this is that we've got a single northern microspecies of elm. We've got 9 East Anglian ones, 11 described from Cambridgeshire, 10 described from Essex, and 6 interesting ones in Cornwall that we tend not to get over here. But you can see that Cambridgeshire is next to the greatest diversity, and those species actually occur in our own county. I've said that this is a very controversial approach to naming elm trees. Peter Sell was known, botanists regard themselves in two camps, splitters and lumpers. Lumpers would see 2 elms. Peter Sell, the ultimate splitter, saw 62 elms. I think I found about 20 more than that. So we're looking informally at about 80 taxa. The paper at the top here, 3 years ago, produced a global classification of elms based on their genetics, working with Cecily Marshall, who used to be in Cambridge and has now moved to Oxford, which I gather has a university as well. Alex Prendergast from Natural England and myself have been gathering samples from the full range of British elms and putting them through the same genetic lab in the United States as Whittemore's paper looked at, and that gives us some data. So on this slightly fuzzy diagram, the green stuff at the top are global elm studies from Whittemore's paper. The large blue block in the middle are British elms that I and my colleagues have sampled and had sequenced in the same lab that Whittemore used. And then the non-elms, there are things like Zelkova, just demonstrating that relatives of elms are a long way removed from the bulk of the elms. I should say these data arrived last week, so I've not had a chance to look in any detail. But what it does show to me, essentially, if you're looking at the tree diagram on the left, the longer the distances between the branches, the more genetically diverse the species are. The wych elms form a neat cluster at the bottom, the other rough-leaved and hybrid elms somewhere in the middle, and there's a huge diversity of smooth-leaved elms. And quite excitingly for me, some of those clusters are genetically much further apart than the fully accepted North American and Asiatic elms. So there is definitely something here. It's not an entirely a figment of Peter Sell's and my imagination. And if you want to read more about Cambridgeshire elms, I wrote a fairly detailed paper with a few photos and a lot of words in Nature in Cambridgeshire last year. I can highly recommend that if you want chapter and verse. In the same issue, and this is why I mentioned leaf mines and plant galls earlier, 2 Cambridge undergraduates worked with me and with Cecily Marshall to look at the insects on elms. They took over 2,000 samples. From those samples, they demonstrated that the insects can tell the difference between the microspecies of elm. So even if botanists don't think they exist, the insects that have co-evolved with them over the last 10 million years seem to note the difference. So that's all I wanted to say. Elms are diverse, they're exciting, they're interesting. We have huge numbers in Cambridgeshire. We still have some very fine mature trees with an awful lot of suckering regrowth. And I'd be glad to talk to anybody who thinks they've got interesting elms on their land. Thank you.
Well, Brian, thank you. Little did we know how diverse the humble elm is. And I'm delighted to say, I think I've just seen the elm on our boundary in your photograph. If there are any questions, please put your hands up now, I think is the answer. And if you could stop sharing that screen, Brian, that would be great.
Oh, apologies. Yeah. There we go.
That'd be lovely. Questions for anybody? Okay, well, I'll start you off. Brian, what should we be planting in terms of an elm tree? Because the trouble is, I find we get a lot of natural regeneration, and they last for about 5 or 10 years, and then they die away.
Yeah, my impression, having looked at an awful lot of trees, is that they're getting stronger each time, that each regrowth seems to last longer and grow taller than the previous ones. So with the single exception of English elm, the small roundleaf species is extremely susceptible still. And that almost always self-copies at about 5 to 10 years and no more than about 8 or 10 meters. Many of the smooth-leaved elms I'm now seeing regularly growing to 30, 40, 50 feet. And I suspect surviving 20 or 30 years. There are also large numbers of surviving big trees out there. And working with Kew and with John Innes Institute and others, we're actually looking at, is there real genetic resistance in those trees, or did they simply escape by accident? My hunch is it's a mixture of the two. The classic Cambridgeshire elm, the big tree down near Shingay, there's a photograph in the herbarium in Cambridge University of that tree in 1975 with Peter Sell saying, dying of Dutch elm disease. And 40 years later, it's in very good health and is growing. So some of our trees have been through the disease, come out the far side. I'm very reluctant to recommend bringing in Asiatic or European or North American elms because they are disease resistant. We know British elms came through a massive bout of something like Dutch elm disease 4,000 years ago, and all we see around us are the progeny of the trees that survived that time. If you can bear not to know what shape of tree you're going to be growing, I would say stick to your local elms. Some of them will revive and come back magnificently. Some of them will make interesting thickets of suckers, which may not be what the average arboriculturalist wants, but as part of a landscape, I think it's a part to play.
Brian, Sue asks the question, should we be planting them? And secondly, which ones?
I'm trying to encourage people to essentially take cuttings from local elms and use local elms in local planting schemes. Certainly on conservation sites and in hedgerows, if you don't care whether you're going to end up with a 60-foot tree or a 20-foot tree, then existing local elms are the ones to use because they're adapted to this local climate. They've been here for thousands of years. Local wildlife's already using them.
Okay, lovely. Any questions from anybody else about elms?
There are a couple more in the chat. Is there a register for mature elm trees from Elizabeth Ranelagh? And from Keith Archer, are hedgerow elms that seem to be vulnerable to disease showing greater signs of resistance?
Okay,
Hedgerows, I'll take hedgerows first, I think. Yes, there is limited sign. In Cambridgeshire, I think we're doing very well with hedgerow elms. I mean, a lot of the roadside elms I see are now starting to mature quite nicely. There's also some evidence that once the trunks get above about a foot diameter at breast height, the bark beetle that's around at the moment that disperses the disease is less likely to attack them. So the beetles are nowadays going for younger trees, and if they get past that phase, then they're unlikely to be infected. Hedgerows do have a lot of English elm in it still, and English elm is the most susceptible. But if you've got smooth-leaved elms, they're likely to do very well, I think. And there are 2 or 3 different registers, but I forget the name of the organisation. The National Tree Register that records veteran trees of all species has several thousand mature elms on its list as well. And there is a book by David Shreve on magnificent surviving elms in Britain coming out next month. I've had a sneak preview of bits of it. I think that's going to be a real appetite whetter for people who like trees and make us realise we've got a lot more elms left than we appreciate.
Brian, Rowan asked the question, I think I would have done actually. Is there a specific methodology of how we can take samples to regrow? And secondly, if not, where can we source some native whips to replant with?
Elms do grow very, very well from cuttings. A friend in Cornwall who's been doing this for a few years simply takes small straight cuttings, pulls the leaves off, sticks them in the bottom half of a large plastic fizzy pop bottle, soil halfway up, put the top back on the bottle, water them once, and they stay humid enough to carry on growing for about 6 months without being watered. And he's getting something like a 90% success rate. Then just plant them out and they do their very best.
Okay, that's a very helpful and very simple tip. Anybody else got any questions?
There's one from Emma. Do you think we'll see an increase in hybridization again as the climate warms?
Really interesting question. But elms have this peculiarity that many elms produce a lot of seed, which is viable, but they flower in February, set seed in March. The seed seems to be viable only for about a month and needs warm soil on which to grow. And we don't have warm soils in Eastern England in March very often. If you get elm seeds falling into something like a gutter, I know Lord de Ramsey his gardener has a wonderful experience of a rooftop underneath an elm, elms forming a 10-centimetre layer in the guttering and starting to decompose and effectively being compost for the later seeds. And he had a gutter full of elm seedlings. So they do produce viable seeds. At the moment, they don't grow in the wild. I think they did in the Bronze Age when temperatures were about 1.5 degrees warmer than present. I suspect in the next century we'll see a lot more elm seeds, and that could well produce some new hybrids.
Okay, Brian, I cannot thank you enough for that fascinating expose of the humble elm. I think it's given us all a lot of to think about, but perhaps we ought to try and getting some back onto our own farms, or at least help people do so. So many thanks. Oh, Matthew's, yeah, we've got a clap hands. So thank you very much, Brian. Very grateful. Okay, moving on to our third speaker then. and I ought to point out is actually the Countryside Regeneration Trust, I think, not Restoration Trust, because Vince will probably correct me otherwise. We're going to hear about the humble water vole, but just to introduce Vince, he's actually a conservation officer with the Countryside Regeneration Trust, which was established in 1993 by a well-known figure in the form of the late Robin Page. He studied biological sciences at UEA, and but in fact entered the world of crop genetics to start with in his career with John Innes. But actually, nature was at his was his hobby and at his heart, and he had a midlife career change and ended up with the Countryside Regeneration Trust, and in particular working on the little water vole and actually trying to make sure he survived with a suitable mink control policy. Hence, the Bourne Brook has water voles. So on that note, Vince, if I could hand over to you. I'm conscious of the fact that you might have quite a few slides. I think we've got about 20 minutes for you to talk and 5 minutes or so for questions after that.
Okay.
So thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm hoping that is working for everybody. If I can find slideshow. Are we good? Is that working? Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you very much, Tim. That's brilliant and really hard act to follow, Brian, as ever. I must invite you to Hardwick Wood and have a look around at our elms. But yes, the water voles are making a comeback in East Anglia, which is something to celebrate. And I thought I could give you a very short update on the start of the evidence for that, and why I'm fairly confident it's going to keep going. As Tim mentioned, it's all down to the mink work that we've been doing. But I thought I'd focus on the water voles rather than the piles of mink, although there will be a dead mink in this presentation if you need a trigger warning. So what is the problem? This unconcerned looking little furry fellow is a water vole, and it is our most rapidly declining native mammal species in Britain, officially, disappearing at great rate. And in Cambridgeshire, there was a report in the Nature in Cambridgeshire, which second mention for that esteemed journal, back in 2004, describing the catastrophic 99.8% crash of the water vole population of Cambridgeshire when Cambridgeshire was Vice County 29 and didn't include Huntingdonshire, in 8 years, in the late 80s, early and the 1990s. And that was part of a national survey that that Jeffries and the Strachan brothers undertook, when concerns were sort of being raised that water voles were suddenly disappearing from places, and they made a very detailed survey of the whole of Great Britain, and looked in particular at Cambridgeshire, which had previously had one of the most strong populations of water voles and seemed to have the highest rate of decline. So numbers were disappearing at great rate, millions of animals disappearing, and that rate has continued to go in the wrong direction since then, through various surveys that have been done. So it is really a rapidly disappearing thing. In the same issue of Nature in Cambridgeshire, I should point out there was a slightly more positive article by Martin Baker and John Green, which sort of indicated that some of the populations in the fens were clinging on a little bit better in Cambridgeshire, and perhaps that the survey sites that had been chosen were on main rivers where mink were more of an effect, and the smaller, reedier places where mink didn't find every last water vole had a slight chance of hanging on to these animals. So I've mentioned mink. They are pretty clearly the main cause of the decline. This is a mink that's just recently caught a young water vole. A female mink is small enough to fit into the same burrow as a water vole, which used to be the water vole's sort of refuge and stronghold where they could survive the plethora of other native predators that will eat them. They had a sort of a bolt hole in their underwater entrance to their burrows, which nothing else could follow them through, but female mink can follow them into those holes and find them and predate them, and they will. In an area with water voles, mink will actively seek them out as the first choice of prey, but then they will easily switch to other items of prey when the water voles have gone out, have been wiped out. So the mink are able to survive on the riverbanks and watercourses long after they've eaten the last water vole. So it's not an evolved predator-prey relationship. The American mink clearly is not native; it's come from America, and water voles are just not equipped to cope with them. So it's pretty clear that is. But there are, there is long-standing evidence of declines of water voles due to drainage and habitat loss and other factors as well. But they are able to tolerate a certain amount of that. So as Tim mentioned, I started this project on the Bourne Brook, which is a small stream flowing through southwest Cambridgeshire into the River Cam. It's the stream that flows through the farm of the Countryside Regeneration Trust, and it has its headwaters quite close to Camborne, where the Wildlife Trust are based. And we worked together since 2010 on a project initially called Born Free, looking at all of the non-native species in that stream, and mink were one of the several that we looked at, including some of the plants. And we've looked at crayfish and walked away from that problem, but we've tackled some of the plants as well during that project. And the Wildlife Trust on this element have been really important in terms of surveying and monitoring the work that we're doing, while our part has been the trapping element. And we very quickly caught a large number of mink on the Bourne Brook, which dispelled the myth that mink were being driven out by otters. One of the sort of straws of hope that were mentioned by Martin Baker in his paper was that otters seemed to be making a comeback and mink were declining as a result. So the first otter sighting on the Bourne Brook was in 1994, I believe. The first recorded sign in modern times, but there were still 50 mink living on that stream in that first winter. So we were using what I've called the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust method, the GWCT method, which is basically a mink raft, which is a sort of floating platform with a slot in the bottom of the platform for a clay plate where you can get footprints, and then above that is a tunnel which is basically enough to attract a mink to explore. So mink will go through, leave their footprints behind. If you see their mink footprints, you put a trap in, and then you have to check that trap every day until you've caught the mink, which is quite time consuming because you need to check your footprints every couple of weeks. So a lot of legwork, exploring the Bourne Brook, putting traps on many farms, lands. We found all the farmers very keen to collaborate on this project, which was helpful. But yeah, very quickly caught most of the mink, and we don't think we've had breeding mink on the Bourne Brook since 2011, when the first full year after starting the project. But they have continued to turn up, and we were catching mink after mink every winter. So we expanded the project to cover a larger area to reduce the flow of mink coming towards us, and also switched to a technological solution of trap alarms in 2014, which meant that we could leave the traps running without having to do a physical daily check, and they just told us when there was something in there which we could then deal with. And the Wildlife Trust surveyed the whole length of the Bourne Brook for the first 7 years of the project, and found that water voles had made a full recovery of the whole length of the stream, but by the end of that period, after having just a very small population in the very higher headwaters of the stream initially. And after that, they Ruth stopped surveying the whole length of the stream, but surveyed most of it in a couple of years later. And these data just show the number of water vole signs. So water voles are not very easy to count individually because they tend to be underground or in the river, in the herbage where you can't see them, but they leave signs, and that's what the survey tends to look for. So latrines, which are the females' sort of areas where they have their piles of droppings and scent mark them by trampling them, very important. Droppings, so just an individual characteristic pellet left behind. and feeding piles. But so when a water vole is feeding, it will crunch the vegetation and leave a 45-degree angle stem on the vegetation. And those signs, as you can see over those 8 years, rapidly increased. So we have a healthy population. So that was enough information to really kickstart an idea in Professor Tony Martin's head that we could eradicate mink from Britain. Why not? It's no point catching mink forever and ever on your stream when you could catch them all and stop them ever coming back. He'd just got back from South Georgia, where he successfully eradicated rats from a very large island, and thought that Britain would be a reasonable size island to take on, and what's the easiest species to do it and most effective one to go for, and mink was the obvious one. So he joined forces with the existing East Anglian water vole and mink group, and we came up with a plan to test the possibility of eradication at a large scale. And the map there shows East Anglia with a green line, and east of that was our core area, and that was the area that we defined as if we could prove an absence or have no evidence of breeding mink in a 12-month period in that area, we could demonstrate that it's possible to do it at a landscape scale. And the area between the green and the red lines is the buffer zone, which is basically where Cambridgeshire sits. And our role in the project was to intercept mink and stop them from getting into the core area. So that thick 60-kilometre boundary was basically the cordon around the eastern part of the project. So we benefited from that hugely. We had some very good funding from the Green Recovery Challenge Fund, which switched us onto a full-scale operation. So the start of January 2021, you can see the red dots on the left-hand map show where smart traps were. So these are traps that are sitting all year round, waiting to catch mink. We had quite a few in Cambridgeshire already because we'd been developing the methodology over those few years. And there were a few in Norfolk and Suffolk and in Essex, but not a continuous network. I should mention that Norfolk and Suffolk had very large county-wide projects using the traditional method, so they had really reduced their mink population rapidly already, which is why it was deemed the best area to do the trial in. But you can see by the end of by the start of 2022, so 1 year later, we'd got well over 500 more of these smart traps deployed across East Anglia, and had a very thorough network of traps in place, which have remained in place ever since, intercepting mink whenever they come by. So that is what a smart trap with a dead mink looks like. The black plastic tunnel floats in the river, the trap sits in it, and the white box on top of the trap has a magnet attached to the trap door. When the trap door closes, the magnet's pulled off and the trap alarm is sent to all the volunteers and the coordinators, so one of whom will then decide amongst themselves who's going to check it. And if it's a mink, it is dispatched as humanely as possibly can be with an air rifle. And every mink that we get is then used for scientific research as part of the modelling of the decline of the mink, which I'm not going to go into. But just to show that the trap captures over the last 4 years, or 5 years rather, in 2020, before we had the network in place, there was a steady capture of mink across all of the counties, which was probably just representing mink moving around. In 2021, we upped the scale quite a lot, and you can see a big increase in mink captures, especially in Cambridgeshire, where there's been very little county-wide trapping going on up till that point. And then the next 2 or 3 years, the numbers have really gone down, such that we declared last year that there were no breeding mink in the core area in 2023. There are still 1 or 2 mink turning up, but they're not close enough to each other to breed, and there's no sign of any of them having given birth, no juveniles being born with genetics that indicates that they're from that region. So each mink is analysed for that sort of purpose. And every now and again, the traps catch something that isn't a mink, and that's the beauty of these traps. You can capture things, you know about it straight away, you can get to them quite quickly, and if it's a a friendly species, you can let it out. So this is a black form water vole. And our volunteer who got to it was so excited to, well, she didn't know what it was to start with, to be honest. She thought it might have been a guinea pig. She was a little bit concerned where that had come from. But she sent me a photo and I said, well, that's a water vole. Yeah, you've got a water vole on your site. And that was the first one. But they can be a bit dim. And if you catch a water vole, they tend to keep coming back into the trap. So we developed these things called excluders, and the first camera evidence that the excluders work was not ideal because the camera was too powerful. But you can see on the two images there's a water vole walking around the mink raft and not able to get into that trap. That trap had caught the same water vole 3 times in the week, and then I put the excluder on and it was unable to get in. We found a better form of camera which had a shorter magnification or less magnifications, and it's mounted on a wooden arm in front of the mink trap, and it tells us when an animal comes by, and we can therefore see that mink were not sort of being deterred by this little wall in front of the trap, but water voles and other things like moorhens were being excluded. So a lot of volunteers spent a lot of time looking at trail camera images and getting some delights like this kingfisher and otters and all sorts of visitors coming by. But
I think if we could get close to wrapping up fairly soon, that'd be lovely.
So this map shows the water voles that we caught before we put those excluders on, and this next one shows the ones afterwards. The important thing to point out is if you compare the two maps, we have an increase in distribution of dots where there are water voles being caught, but fewer actual captures. So once we catch a water vole, we put an excluder on, we don't catch it again generally. So it's a way of telling us that they're spreading, but they're not being caught too many times. And over a third of our traps now have seen water vole action. A lot of these are in places where there's never been a water vole seen for decades. So we know that they're making a comeback. And we've seen more signs, as well as catching them. We also see sort of foot droppings as well. So the population is coming back. It'll be based on the Bourne Brook evidence. It'll be a few more years before we get a full recovery, especially as some areas had no resident populations. And really, what I'm hoping everyone can do is if they do see any water voles, that they submit their sightings. They can send them to me or to the Record Centre or the Mammal Society. Any way of getting those data, we want to see the recovery of this, because the evidence of the success is going to mean that we get funding coming to keep this going. And our next big job, really, working with the Water Life Recovery Trust, is to expand this to the whole of Britain. And it's happening already. We've got now expansion into Northamptonshire and Bedfordshire and many other counties. And yes, the method works. It's relatively simple and effective and cheap, and it's quite quick. So that's my talk, and thank you from all the water voles of East Anglia for your attention. And yeah, happy to take some questions. I should say that photo by Emily Coleman, she is my sidekick in Cambridgeshire, and I couldn't do this without her at all. I mean, she's actually essential that we have 2 people running the project. Okay, thank you.
Vince, I can't thank you enough for that. That was a fascinating story of how citizen science can help a massive recovery in a single species. Roger.
Yes, great talk, Vince, and yes, look forward to the total eradication of mink in this part of the world. Of course, it was done for the coypu, so I know it was a smaller population. What I want to ask you was, what about other predators? Pike, polecats, herons? Are these important? Is there a growing importance, or are we in balance now?
Yeah, well, yes, everything appreciates a water vole for lunch. The first proof that we had the breeding water voles on the CRT farm was a body in a barn owl box. So yeah, lots of things eat them. But they are rodents which breed prolifically. 3 litters a year, 4 to 6 young at a time. The firstborn of the spring are breeding by the end of the summer, so they can cope with a heavy lot of predation. I think, yeah, the predation probably affects the juveniles and a few of the males which are looking for females, but not in the way that mink will take the breeding females out of the dens. You know, it's nothing like that. So yeah, they're there as part of the ecosystem. Yeah,
I'm going to briefly take two questions from the chat. First of all, is the mink exclusion a permanent project?
Well, the idea is it's not going to be on forever. The idea is that once you've eradicated a species, you don't have to trap it anymore.
Yeah.
So
Okay,
that's the aim really, and it's the faster we can get the whole of Britain under a control regime, you know, the more humane it will be, because we will not be catching mink coming in from untrapped areas into the trapped areas. They can go 50 to 100 kilometers. So we want to get that as fast, and we, you know, there's a lot of talk with government funding for that. So
and lastly, Rupert Gould was asking whether the Bourne Airfield development project, do you think is going to radically affect your recovery on the Bourne?
I can't imagine it's going to have much of an impact on water voles themselves, but yeah, it's likely to have, you know, more hydrological impacts, I suspect. But no, I think the water voles are pretty resilient to development. I mean, I remember as a kid just seeing them in little tiny ditches in Coventry, where I grew up. You know, they quite happily cope with human habitation. That, you know, they're doing really well on those kind of areas. So no, I don't think it's going to affect water voles, but other things.
Okay, Vince, well, thank you very, very much for a fascinating talk about how actually one can make a massive difference with a concerted programme. So thank you very much for that. And we'll move on to our last speaker before I ask Pamela to give us a quick update on LNRS. Our last speaker is, just get my notes, sorry about that, is Andrew Newton. Andrew is an engineer from the Ely group of IDBs, and I think he's a bit of an expert in the history of these IDBs, and in particular the vital role that they play from the point of view of combating flooding and protecting the valuable environmental areas within the fens, and also the productive capacity of the farmland itself. So without further ado, Andrew, I'm going to hand over to you. I think you've got quite an armory of slides. If I could give you sort of 20-25 minutes maximum, that would be wonderful. Many thanks, Andrew.
Okay, then, Tim, thank you very much. Yeah, I will whip through these fairly quickly. I just set this up. So hopefully everyone can see that. So I'm Andrew Newton, the engineer to the Ely Group of Drainage Boards, which is 10 drainage boards around the Ely area. I'll go into that in a bit more detail. What I would say, yes, following 3 fascinating presentations, I'm going to talk to you about drainage. And I used to say when I did this presentation, it's boring, but actually, no, it's not. It's exciting. It's different. There's a real challenge for us going forward into the future. So I think it's actually quite an interesting subject. So some drainage boards, they're not everywhere across England. They're in certain sort of special areas of drainage, and you'll see from here that they're mainly in the fens areas. Over on the Norfolk Suffolk coast, down in Kent, we go across to Somerset, and then up to the north with the Yorkshire and Humberside. So they're the areas, and that's one of the challenges we face, that not everyone knows what an IDB is, because we're not across the country, and even in the local areas, it's one challenge we face, that people are not necessarily aware of the work we undertake. So why IDB is important? Well, predominantly, you know, the history was we were there for protection of agriculture, but that has developed over time. So it's not as well as agriculture, we are protecting transport links, utilities, people's houses, and also more importantly as well, the environment. So in the boards that I look after, we have Wick and Fen, we have the Lake and Heath Reserve, we also have the new RSPB Reserve, the Used Washes Habitat Project at Coveney, Wardy Hill, just to name a few. So it's not all about protecting agriculture, though the majority is. It has developed over time. So in England, we have 112 internal drainage boards that cover those areas, covering about 9% of the country. And actually, one of the boards that I look after, Caudle Fen, has is famous for being the smallest board. It's a small board around Ely that's only 182 hectares. Now, the development of drain IDBs and pumping. So in the 1600s, we had the Dutch gentleman called Van Muyden that came over, and worked with the adventurers to drain the fens. Now, it was always the idea that the drainage would be by gravity, but it was quickly found because of the drying out of the peat and the lowering of the land levels, another solution was needed. So it started off with wind pumps, that then moved on in the 1700s to the steam pump. Following that, we had the invention of the diesel pumps. And this site here is our 100-foot pumping station over near the village of Plymore. It pumps into the 100-foot river, the part of the used washes system. And this is a site that's had all elements of pump. So it started with wind, it then had steam, diesel, and now has a modern day electric pump. And with our electric pumps, this is the Cam pumping station, just near the village of Wicken. And this, if you look on the right-hand side, the two smaller pumps, these were two of the first fish-friendly pumps to be installed in the UK. They were built and installed by Bedford Pumps, and they were to replace an old diesel pumping station that's just out of shot of the picture. So that's sort of an overview of development of pumping over time. So for the Ely group that I manage, we consist of, say, 10 drainage boards. We go from the north of Cambridge, sort of cover Willingham, Cottenham, go up to the 100-foot washes, and then we go up towards Denver, and then back down covering Mildenhall, Lakenheath, Soham, back down to the Swaffhams and heading back towards Cambridge, covering an area of 45,000 hectares. And over there we have about 29 pumping stations that we're managing across those boards. Middle Fen and Mere is what we call the parent board, so it owns the office that I'm based in, the administration centre. We work for Middle Fen and Mere, and we act as a consultant for the other 9 boards. And we have workforce and plant that we share amongst those drainage boards to undertake our maintenance works. The advantage is by sharing resources and only having one admin centre, that we then could share the same policies, etc., and we're saving money and being more cost effective. What I should have said also previously on the IDBs around the country. There are different groups of IDBs, and for instance, in Cambridgeshire, we have the middle level commissioners, and also the boards that they administer. We also have the North level board. Now, what you'll find is that though we're all the same and trying to meet the same aims, because we are separate groups, we will have slightly different policies, aims, and how we achieve things. About 7 years ago, we then, from this office here at Prickwillow, we started to administer the Down and Market group of drainage boards. So that's going from Denver up to Kings Lynn. So that's 6 drainage boards covering about 26,000 hectares with about 18 pumping stations that we manage. So today from this office, we're looking after 16 drainage boards. So as I said, to give you an overview, looking down at the bottom here, Cambridge, this is the area now covering. So we're going from Cambridge all the way up to south of Kings Lynn, back down to Used Washes. There's a couple of drainage boards here, Hadnam, Swavesey and over, managed by the middle level currently. But this is the area that we're sort of covering now from the one office at Prickwillow. So our governance, so we have a board, and the board is made up of an elected chairman by the board and a vice chairman. We have board members that are elected from the agricultural ratepayers, so these are the landowners and the farmers. And normally the election is every 3 years. And also we have board members appointed by district councils. So these are the district councillors that sit on the board. Our funding, so we have drainage rates levied on landowners. So for the Ely group, we're bringing in across those 10 boards £2.12 million. And from the district councils, it's 0.95 million. The special levy is raised by the district councils on our behalf. It's a levy that we made, so they have to pay us. Many years ago, the boards used to collect that money themselves, but it was found back in the late 70s, early 80s, it was included in the council tax system. So overall, our budget for maintenance works is just over £3 million. We also receive Highland water payments from the Environment Agency, so this is water that's coming outside the catchment into our areas. And also, when we undertake major projects, we can claim or apply, should I say, through the Environment Agency for DEFRA grant in aid. One of the biggest things I would say over this last winter is the challenge we've had with our pumping costs. We've had extremely wet summer last year, moving into the winter period, and that has really put significant pressure on our finances from our electric usage for pumping. which we've been able to try and claw some of that back from a one-off government grant that we've been lucky enough to apply for this year. But it does cause me concerns of how we're going to potentially fund that going forward into the future as we see more of these different rainfall events. So the pumping and why we're looking at today. So why do we need pumping still? So if you look on the right-hand side, this is just a basic schematic we've got that shows that the average fen water level in our area is 97 metres. Now that's actually 3 metres below sea level. So in the fens, we work to self-level datum. So 100 is 0 in terms of sea level. So actual average fen water level is 97 metres, sorry, 3 metres below sea level, and the average land level is 1 metre below. So we're using our pumping stations to pump up into mainly the EU system in this area, where the normal river level is about 1.5 metres above sea level. So on average, we're pumping out 5 to 6 metres. That's the lift of our pumping stations. And then going through to Denver Sluice, or we're then going out into the tide, where the high tide could be 106 metres. So you can see there's a significant difference from our water level in the fens up to the potential high tide levels. And I borrowed this map from the Environment Agency, and this shows that if flood defences were allowed to deteriorate, this is the actual bowl and the different levels, how the fens would flood over a period of time. I think it's over about a 2-year period. That's how that bowl in the area would fill up. Our roles as pumping stations, what we do, so we build and maintain pumping stations. As I said, we control 29 pumping stations from this area. Mainly the pumping stations are set up to run automatically, either on level or timers that we put in place. Obviously, we want to try and keep our pumping to the minimum to save our costs, but we mainly undertake that activity overnight when we can benefit from the cheaper rate electricity. We undertake our grass cutting works, keeping the channel sides clear. Obviously, we have a certain conservation working window, and we have changed our methods over the years as well. For instance, only cutting one side 1 year and rotating that, and changing the different stretches that we manage on a yearly basis. We're following it on with undertaking weed cutting so we can keep the channels clear, to make sure that we can convey water down into our pumping stations. Stretching and improvement works, we do undertake regular slubbing works. This is quite a bit severe project. This was actually from a few years ago, and there's a housing estate that was built up in Lidsport further upstream here. So the channel, this project was to improve the channel capacity to allow the new water from this new development to come into our system, so it could cope and not overwhelm our pumping station that you can see in the distance. One of the other items that we have, though, in internal drainage boards, really this kicked off from 1976 and the severe drought. We are heavily involved in irrigation. So basically in the winter, a lot of the farmers and landowners are telling me to pump the water away. And then in the summer, they're telling me to put asking me to put the water back so they can irrigate. And we do that by opening basically taps on the river embank systems, and it allows the water via gravity to come into our systems. And then we have several structures where we can divert the water to where it's needed. There's 2 real benefits from this raising summer levels, and we raise it roughly by about 1 metre. One is there is water for irrigation, but obviously it does have a great improvement. It benefits the environment as well over that summer period to stop to hopefully our drains running dry. And I think this is, I'll touch on this when I talk about the future, but I think this is where we're now moving from a case of being just drainage and irrigation. We now really need to focus on water management and looking at that as one entity. So water vole, so Vince there spoke about the water vole. Obviously it's a protected species and we need to be mindful of that. And a few years ago now, we used to do regular surveys ahead of our slubbing programs, but our conservation officer, consultant, should I say, at the time, we found that we was actually getting quite a number of water vole sightings. So we've made that special effort now to try and improve our methods and change our methods of how we undertake in maintenance to make sure that we are protecting the water voles. And we still find them in good numbers. And for instance, the Anglian Water Spa project is a strategic pipeline that's coming down from Lincolnshire, and where it crosses my area, basically down the market down to Isleham. I think majority, I think there's only one main drain that they're crossing where they've not found evidence of water voles, where they're having to do water vole mitigation. So that's really good news. And as Vince mentioned, Dr. Tony Martin, he's actually a ratepayer in one of the boards that I look after. And I met him on a site visit about something else, and we got talking. And actually that led to the Ely Group and the Downham Market Group being the first boards to help fund some of the traps in our local area around Ely and be part of that successful project. Barn owls, we also work with the Hawks and Owls Trust, so we have barn owl boxes on the majority of our pumping stations, and they will come down and undertake annual surveys on them, and we've actually just purchased a load of new barn owl boxes to replace the ones that they're getting a bit old now, so we're going to have a scheme to replace them over the winter, ready for next season. And eels, obviously eels, we have the eel regulations, protected species, as I spoke about the CAM, we put fish-friendly pumps in there. I'm not going to lie to you, it is a bit of a delicate subject for drainage boards because eels, it is quite costly, the solutions to try and protect them and get them in and out of the systems. And some of the technology is not fully tested yet, but where we're undertaking refurbishment works and major capital projects, we are now trying to implement and put in place measures so eels can pass safely in and out of our catchment systems. And this is going to be a long-term process as we upgrade our pumping stations. In terms of planning development, we do also look at that. We have some concerns there here in terms of large-scale planning, the effect it will have on our system. So our pumping stations are only designed to a certain greenfield runoff rate. And then if we have large-scale developments coming, discharging straight into our systems, it could overwhelm our pumping capacity. So we comment on a lot of plan applications, whether they're in the Bors district or on the periphery that could flow into our districts. And we have bylaws to protect us. So developers who wish to discharge into our area will need our consent. And often we're asking for balancing ponds, etc., to be put in place to protect our systems. We also have bylaws to protect building against our main drains, so we can make sure that we can maintain our access to undertake maintenance. First Drove Reservoir, this is an aerial photo of a reservoir that's just situated outside of Ely. The smaller reservoir is a balancing reservoir that's low level, and it contains up to 25,000 cubic meters of water. And that pumps into the larger holding reservoir you can see at the side that can take up to 250,000 cubic meters. This has been in place now about 24 years, and it was to facilitate large-scale development along the edge of Ely, along the outside the A10. So those developments do not have any suds or balancing ponds on site. All the water comes down to the catch water, and it's captured in this system. Now, this was funded and by the developers, but it was given to the board with a commuted sum to manage going forward into the future. And so why I raise this is a picture of the low balancing pond. So the higher level holding reservoir comes under the Reservoir Act, so we have strict management regime for that. So we have to have it inspected every year. So we have to follow what the supervising engineer says, but we have more scope to manage the lower balancing pond more sensitively. So these are reed beds that we manage and allow to grow out. We also planted a woodland 24 years ago at the side of this on land that wasn't used as part of the scheme, but was bought from the farmer. The beauty of this site is there's no public access, so it's quite remote. It only tends to have my foreman go down there once a week to look at it. And we've allowed Ely Wild Space and the British Trust of Ornithology to undertake surveys on there. And Brian mentioned the white pinion moth, and that has been found on this site as well as a couple of rare orchids when I took Tony Martin down there. So it is a great site that we can manage sensitively, but also it's remote. So it's not being trampled by the public, should we say. And future for the fens. I think it is a challenging time for the fens. Obviously, it is one of the fastest growing areas, but also water management of water is becoming a scarce resource. The Environment Agency are currently undertaking a project called the Fens 2100, working with flood risk management partners, and that's going to look at what does flood risk management look at going forward into the future. And this is the whole Fens from Cambridgeshire up into Lincolnshire. And I think that's an important project of making a potential step change. So the last major floods in this area in 1947, obviously after the Second World War, there was a major need for food production. That's where all the major investment was undertaken in terms of flood risk management and new channels. All those assets are now coming to the end of their life, including some of my pumping stations. And it's now a case of, how do we go forward into the future? We also have the challenge of the peat issue as well. And we've been working with Fenland Soils on that, and also working with DEFRA. And potentially, if we do raise levels in this area, we're going to still need to have pumping, because you still need to manage the water, but we're going to have major investment in probably bigger pumps and better technology. So we have more scope to manage levels at a higher level. But when we do have those high water events and thunderstorms, we can still get rid of the water. And also, I think potentially we need to see them as mosaic in the fens, so we can still, potentially protect the peatland areas that are there, have environmental sites, but also still have food production going forward into the future. So really, that's just my quick whistle-stop tour of IDBs. Now, I know there's a lot of slides there, but I tried to get through them as quickly as I could, Tim. But again, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Andrew, thank you very much for that. A very good whistle-stop tour, as you say, around the fens. There were two questions on the chat bar. First one was bearing in mind the oxidization that takes place already from peat in the fens. Do we think the fens are over-drained? Maybe a question beyond your engineering side of it. And I don't know whether John Shrops was still on the call, but John may have a view about that. Anybody want to answer that question? John.
I think I'll kick off. I suppose it's a difficult one for me to ask, because obviously I'm in the business of drainage, etc. And what I would say from a drainage point of view, we have a whole range of customers, from farmers to environmental organisations in this area, that are competing for different water needs and water levels. Obviously, drainage, you can't get away from it. There has been an effect on the lowering of the land levels and peat. I think, working with Fenland Soils, I think we need to have that better data to make sure that we can manage water levels correctly going forward. But I think, we still need to have that balance of food production, protection of the peat, but also, if we don't have pumping, transport networks are going to be affected, infrastructure is going to be affected. So a lot of people in the Fenland areas, in the south level that I look after, if we look at those assets, we have a lot of assets that are aging that's going to cost a lot of money to repair. But we have not so many people at risk of flooding because on the higher ground. But services, roads, transport links go across the low ground, so they still need to be protected. So I think we have to be careful how we manage going forward into the future.
John, did you want to add to that?
I can't really add that much. I mean, Andrew answered that really well, but the fens is made up of a lot of different soil types. I mean, large parts of the fens, the peat is largely gone already. So those areas are described as wasted peat or skirt fen, and there's very little peat left. So raising water tables is going to achieve nothing on those, and it'd be virtually impossible to do. I think the deeper peats, which there's a deep peat, there's about 8,000 hectares left, I think, is the number. And as Andrew said, I think the possibility of a mosaic of solutions for this subject, whereby some parts of it are basically the water tables are raised to conserve the peat. I mean, the issue isn't so much conservation of peat, it's actually reducing the CO2 coming out of the peat. That's the problem. As the peat shrinks, it's giving off the CO2. So I think a mosaic of solutions so that we continue farming and conserve the peat, reduce the CO2. And there's been quite a lot of work done by Fenland Soil, and they've conducted a major polluticulture trial this year with growing crops on a very high water table, sort of at 15 centimetres. There's investment going into learning more about that.
Thank you, John. Roger, you've got a question, and then we must move on to ask Pamela if she'll give us an update on LNRS.
Thanks, Andrew, for that talk. Under the Environment Act, as a public body, your duty to conserve is now to enhance as well nature.
have you upped your game, and do you think you can help Natural Cambridgeshire to double nature in Cambridgeshire on this fantastic blue water network of waterways that you have?
Yes, Roger, I think you're right. We are a public body, so we do have that duty. ADA have recently published, say recently over the last 12 months or so, a sort of conservation guide handbook for IDBs to follow. There is a gold standard and there's a basic standard. I think from my personal point of view, I have to manage people's expectations, and I would like to try and at least achieve that middle ground. So what we're doing, I've had a bit of a hiatus because our conservation advisor consultant moved away. It's not worked out because she's too far away. And our health and safety consultant has actually got environmental qualifications. She's just completed those. So we're looking now to expand our work with her to try and make improvements going forward in the future. I think also probably, Roger, we're probably fine for some of our waterways. We've got some hidden gems that are not discovered and not been surveyed that we need to potentially work together on and getting some surveys done so we can get that baseline going as well. But certainly it's something that we do need to be mindful and make some improvements. I think we're started, but we can make improvements. But I have to be mindful on how I manage people's expectations, and that's farmers as well as people from an environmental point of view.
Thank you, Andrew. Matthew, did you want to add to that?
Yes, just to say, I mean, I think that this network of drains and ditches and the whole kind of understanding about not just drainage, but actually managing water is, I think, one of the key issues for us. It absolutely fits with our Natural Cambridge interests in terms of biodiversity, because the water is absolutely central for that. The odd bit about water is not only that we have very hot topics like sewage in water, in rivers and so forth, but the whole kind of question of which we run water is very odd. It's dominated by a 19th century idea of kind of public water supply, which dominates all the investment views of things, and they basically we don't think of water as an overall system. We allow the water to go out and then we come back in again, and we don't have enough storage. So I think there is a big moment for us to be thinking about the management of water properly, not just drainage, but managing water. And I think that the IDBs, as the kind of big report done last year or the year before about lowland pay, the investment into the IDBs is really very important, and it will then leave us with a landscape with much more water in it, which will be much more interesting for biodiversity as well.
Thank you. John, did you want to add to that? Was that a legacy hand? I think a legacy. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Legacy, sorry.
Did you want Andrew? Thank you very much for that. It's given us a very good expose of just how important your role and the IDBs are, and it's a significant challenge for you to satisfy environmentalists and farmers and cope with development all in one go. So we wish you well, and thank you for your expose on the IDBs. Pamela, I promised you 15 minutes, and I've just about got there. Andrew, if you could finish sharing the screen, that'd be great.
My screen apparently is loading. Oh no, and have I frozen? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, yeah.
Brilliant. And you may or may not be able to see my slides, is that true?
Yeah, you can't see them at the moment.
Okay, I will, as we have quite limited time, I will move on, and then at some point I hope that my slides will appear. So I just wanted to give an overview for those who are relatively new to local nature recovery strategies. This came about from the 2018 25-year Environment Plan, followed up by the 2021 Environment Act. And we are working on this as Natural Cambridgeshire in partnership with the Combined Authority of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, and also with the County Council, who have been asked to implement this on behalf of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, working together with all of the local authorities in the area. Oh, and there, I think you now have my screen.
Yep, thank you.
Lovely. And fundamentally, what we've been asked to do is to produce a map of all of the sites which are currently important and valued, a statement of what is in our area, as well as both in terms of the map and in terms of the statement, where we have priorities across the county for recovering or enhancing, and how we might go about doing that. And in relation to those things, there are regulations, so things that we absolutely have to do. And then also there is guidance in terms of the process which we are following. And just to emphasise that, as in many places in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, we are not starting from scratch. There is already the vision to double nature, which you've already heard. There's already wonderful work going on, which we've heard in this presentations and in many previous presentations. And from all of this work and from some of the work that's been going on already, we are starting to build a vision for creating a sort of wildlife-rich, resilient, productive and sustainable landscape for people and nature. And we, of course, already have some priority landscapes, and many of the other priorities which are existing already are being fed into this. And this is a diagram of the process that we've been following to date. We are already very far along this route, and we have been already mapping the areas of importance, mapping where nature recovery has happened already, and many of the local authorities have their own plans, often in collaboration with environmental NGOs, plus national and local organisations have been sharing their plans of where they've been taking action to date. And these are all moving into a local habitat map and into our sort of description of the area and into our statement of biodiversity priorities, and a little bit more on that as I move through. So the progress to date is the overarching process for this is that we really need to be having an inclusive process that includes stakeholder engagement. And in April, we had surveys with over 1,300 people contributing to that. We've had 11 stakeholder workshops with farmers and landowners throughout Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, and we've held workshops in communities throughout as well. We have been gathering in data, and we've been including already those land use strategies and policies which are at local, national level, and understanding these wider environmental benefits. So, for example, around water availability, around flood relief, and all of those other elements where the natural environment has its part to play beyond biodiversity and into climate as well. And just to say that this is it's been important so far that this is a really inclusive process, and that we communicate this very well. Part of that is this, and the next stage of this, when it comes around, will be a public consultation on the draft that has been produced so far. So this includes some of the meetings where we've been listening to stakeholders, and also you may recognise some of yourselves in this series of workshops which have happened already. And we will be circling round this process again when we have a draft. So we're at the intermediate stage at the moment where we're gathering everything in, deciding how to present it best, deciding how it all operates together, and then coming back out more widely with this to all of the people in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough and all of the stakeholder groups, to make sure that actually what we've collected and what we've listened to so far to everybody still has resonance and is something that people feel they can get behind. I've managed to do my screen, so I can't actually see that list at the moment. So in terms of the habitats that we have come up with so far, these are based on the UK Biodiversity Action Plan broad habitats and priority habitats. And our next stage of circling round will be to translate these into habitats that are very understandable by everybody. So, for example, at the moment, we've got the fen and marsh, and we've got fen rivers and ditches. It might be that we just want to say something like fen landscapes in the future, and we'll be consulting on how we do that. We know already that chalk streams, you know, are a real priority in our area, but we also know that we have some really important drains, which, as we've heard, are very important for drains and ditches for water voles, and also these sort of linear boundary features that move through. So we have a list, and what we're doing at the moment is thinking how we can map this list, and also thinking what can we do to create more to enhance these and in general make these priority landscapes sort of come alive and enable everybody to feel that their area is important, and there's something that everybody can do as an individual, as a group, as groups of landowners. And we know there are already existing clusters of landowners and collaborations throughout the landscape. For example, in the John Clare countryside up in the northwest, there's a real vision and a commitment to restoring nature in that farmed landscape, as well as down in the east of the county, where southeast of the county, where Tim farms, a real commitment from landowners there to gather together and to improve the chalk streams and the surrounding landscapes. So in all of the areas, we are seeking to work with those who are already working there, and also to enhance and expand that. Alongside that, we have been working with the biological record centres to look at what species are important in Cambridgeshire. And some of those species have come out today. For example, the white-spotted pinion moths are on that list from the input from our record centre and from the county recorders, as well as our water voles. And we've created from this, under the guidance, a list of all of those species which are threatened or near threatened, that are already included in action plans, so none of that existing work is lost. And then there's additional species of interest, and in both that's plants, liverworts, amphibians. It's kind of all species, as well as birds that have a concern on the red list and nationally rare. And we also have an additional category of where there are Cambridgeshire species which might be abundant in the county, but where we hold a really important reservoir of those species. So we're trying to cover all of those really important species that are valuable to us, and then look at how some will be part of assemblages which will be addressed in terms of habitat plans, and some need particular recovery actions because those species need that particular attention. And within that, we're looking at the threat level, the significance, and how we might be able to deliver those interventions that will align with management of whatever the area is. And we are currently at the stage of getting our steering group to review the species priorities for our record centre to make any final adjustments, and then to be looking at how we put those measures, so those actions and those important sites, and so that when we express it, we can talk about, for example, elm woodlands, and we can talk about white-spotted pinion moss. So it becomes something that is very accessible, and people can look at those species that all go together in those habitats. After this, when we have done this, the next step will be the public consultation, which will happen later in the autumn, we are hopeful, and then we will get back all of the feedback, and then we will have a final draft of the LNRS. We do have a website to keep up to date with progress, which I've popped on here. And then I was going to share with you more of the detail around some of the very special species and habitats, but I note that we are at 11:56, and so I've rather whizzed through that in more scarce detail than I might otherwise have. But just to say that the farmed landscape is very important for its farm and bird habitats, but also for those wet hollows that might be in the chalky clay lands for grass polly and fairy shrimps, churchyards and road verges. Really, really important for kind of these refuges of ancient grasslands and corridors connecting the arable landscape and the woodlands. So not only elm woodlands, but oxlip woods and ancient trees, as well as we've heard, the sort of ancient orchard trees, as well as those pollarded trees and pollarded elms. I'm going to stop now because we are nearly at the end of our time. And I'll stop with
Pamela, thank you very, very much for that very clear and succinct update. I'm sorry we didn't have any more time, but if anybody's got a quick question for Pamela about the LNRS, I know that I think you've answered one question already that somebody put in the chat, which was when's the public consultation coming out, which the answer is the autumn. Any other, Quinton would like to ask a question.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Just Quinton Carroll, Head of Natural Historic Environment at the County Council. I just want to say thank you to Natural Cambridgeshire and to Pamela in particular for taking us through this. As some colleagues know, have been quite seriously ill for the past year, and Pamela in particular has really stepped in to help guide you forward with my colleagues here at the council. So I just wanted to publicly say thank you for that help.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And I would add to that, because this is, in the background, all of you may not be aware, but this is a massive piece of work that has landed on the county, and in turn with Pamela and Natural Cambridgeshire. And it shouldn't be underestimated the amount of work that has gone into this already. We are only on a journey, and it hasn't finished yet. But if we get it right, I think we can see some significant change for the environment alongside the farmed landscape. So thank you very much for that. Any other questions? Okay, right. I think we're just about there. I know that there has been a request that in the next forum we try and concentrate a little bit on water, and we'll take that away and work on that. Suffice to say, for those who are interested, I have actually got the first water attenuation trial on my farm, which has gone out to contractors to survey, and the idea being to see whether we can capture water to push it into the aquifer over and above that naturally percolates during a storm. And if we can do that, we can significantly boost the aquifers that have been drained so heavily over the last 30, 40 years, and see whether we can recover some of the chalk stream network. Sharon, last question, and then we must close.
Hi, sorry, it's in the chat. So this was for Pamela, that we've got a couple of residents with like 2 to 3 acre wildflower meadows. Should they register those with you somehow?
I think it'd be great to hear with them. We're more of a network organisation, so I think we might be putting you in touch with the particular relevant people that might be able to give more support with that. But certainly come to us in the first instance, and then we'd be delighted to hear. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
On that note, I think we'll probably draw it to close. Helen, do we have a date for the next one? Just so people can put it in their diary.
Yeah, a good question. It's the 11th of December, I believe.
There we are, everybody. 11th of December. Thank you for coming along in such huge numbers, and I hope it's been of interest and worthwhile today. Next one, 11th of December. See you there. Many thanks. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you.